Hi, welcome back and happy Monday. Today is Monday the 21st, and today we are going to start back with our story of Almost Super, and we are on chapter 7. Watch this. Hope you guys had a good weekend. Hey, and I have my superpower colors on again. Still using my superpower color mug for my drink. All right, let's get started. Chapter 7, watch this. I met Benny outside his class right as lunch began. Students poured out of the rooms, pushing and shoving their way into the halls. We fought through the crowds, making our way towards the library. In the chaos, I could talk to Benny in relative. Oh, yes, that's right. In the chaos, I could talk to Benny in relative privacy. We've got to move fast, I told Benny about the new teacher. There are now 2 Johnsons right here inside the school. And one of them is a you-know-what. A super is what I wanted to say, but couldn't. I shook my fist. Benny raised his eyebrows. Will you have to shake your fist every time you talk to your teacher? What about the parent-teacher conferences? Holy cow, that's going to be awkward. We got to the library and I stepped inside and pulled out my phone to text Rodney. Send Juanita. I was about to hit send when I happened to glance up. Sitting at a table towards the back of the library with her feet on the table was Juanita Johnson. She was reading a book. I lurched to a stop and Benny crashed into me. I didn't have time to think. I grabbed Benny by the sleeve and I ducked behind a book cart off to the left. I fell to the ground, pulling Benny down next to me. My brother crouched on his hands and knees, looking at me in alarm. What is it? What did you? I put a finger to my lips, and Benny... Excuse me. And I put a finger to my lips, and Benny fell silent. I raised my head, peeking around the corner of the cart. Juanita was totally engrossed in her book. I didn't think she'd seen us. Scanning the room, I could see Mr. Wells in his office eating lunch, and there was no sign of anyone else. Juanita looked up, and I dropped back behind the cart. Benny mouthed the words, "What's going on?" I motioned towards Juanita, was setting, and mouthed her name. Benny peeked around the cart and whispered, "So? Isn't the whole plan to talk with her and find out about the Johnsons did to our powers?" He shook his fist. "But she shouldn't be here," I said. "I was counting on surprising her. Rodney was going to send her a text, but it's like she knew exactly what..." And then it hit me. I smacked my forehead. "I'm so dumb." "What?" Benny asked. "We talked about our plan on the bus." "You're not making any sense," Benny said. "Juanita is a super, I explained. That means she has super hearing. She probably sat in the back of the bus and heard every word we said. If she knows our plan, we could be walking right into a trap." "A trap?" Benny said. "In the library? What kind of trap can you set in a library? What's she going to do? Throw a 'I love to read' poster at us?" My brother had a point. As long as Mr. Wells was watching, she wouldn't be able to use her powers against us. "This wasn't part of the original plan," I said. Benny shrugged. "We'll wing it." "Wing it?" I took a deep breath. "Okay, get ready." And I stood up. Juanita was gone. Benny got up and looked around. "Well, that's a little strange," he muttered. In front of us was an open area. Tables where students could read dotted the floor. The only way Juanita could have gotten past us was to walk through the door behind us. There was a desk to one side of the door where Mr. Wells checked out books. That left only one other place. She must have gone back into the stacks, Benny said. To our right, a large bookshelf divided the open area and the stacks. Our library is a little different than most schools. One of the parents in the school district made a lot of money selling mechanical bookcases. to big universities and public libraries. While they remodeled our school about 5 years ago, the parent donated one of these systems. The bookshelves are mostly crammed together with just a few aisles in between. When you press a button on the side of the bookcase, the aisle in front of you opens up, and somewhere else the bookcase is closed. The good news is this allows you to pack more books into smaller place. The bad news is a supervillain can use this to her advantage. Benny, I said. Yeah? I think I just realized how Juanita could spring a trap. I pointed to the area of the library where Juanita had disappeared. With a push of a button, she could smash us flat. Benny shook his head. That's not how it works. There's a safety mechanism that keeps them from happening. If somebody is in the aisle, then the bookcases don't close. Benny, Juanita has all the powers. How long do you think it would take Rodney to disable that safety mechanism, I asked. Benny looked over at me. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Then finally said, "That's not good." I hesitated. We were still standing close enough to the door that we could run away. Students were walking through the halls on the way to the cafeteria. Juanita might not dare to attack us in the open, but if we went back into the stacks, we'd be out of sight of both the students and Mr. Wells. Benny saw hesitation. "Rafter," he said, "if we don't face Juanita now, we'll be afraid every single day of the rest of our lives. This is what being super is all about." I wondered if this is what the ferocious courage Grandpa talked about, and if it was the healthy dose of insanity. Maybe it was a little of both. "Stay close," I said. "We'll go into the stacks just long enough to lead Juanita back out here to the open area. Got it?" Benny nodded. A long bookcase stood before us. On the left was a walkway leading back into the stacks. A large mural of split rock was painted on the wall. On the right was another walkway, also leading into the stacks. I walked slowly down the walkway to the left. I kept my eyes trained right, searching for Juanita. When we reached the back wall, we still hadn't seen her. "Where'd she go?" Benny asked. "She must be hiding on the other side," I whispered. "Either that or she's invisible." We stood in the corner of the stacks with the mural behind us. I felt more than a little claustrophobic. We could scoot to the other walkway, but that meant walking between a bookcase and a solid brick wall. Juanita would be able to close the shelves on us. "It's like being stuck between a rock and a bookcase." Benny was trying to be funny, but his voice sounded nervous. I took a step inside the aisle. There were about 3 feet between the brick wall and to my left and the bookcase to my right. The shelves didn't move fast, but Juanita might have modified that as well. The bookcases loomed like they were like a wave waiting to crash over us. I took another step and then another. We were halfway back down the aisle when I heard Juanita's voice pierce the quiet library. "Show me what you got, villains. Make your move." I stopped dead in my tracks. My brain couldn't register what she just said. Benny spoke behind us, calling into the shelves. "Who in the heck are you talking to?" Again, Juanita's voice floated through the library. It hissed and hit my ear. "To the only villains in this school, Rafter and Benny Bailey." I heard what sounded like a spitting noise. Benny twirled his finger around his ear and mouthed the word cuckoo, cuckoo. "We're not villains." I felt like an idiot for stating such an obvious fact. I also felt like an idiot talking to a bunch of books on a shelf. My words were met with a burst of laughter. "Right, not villains. You boys must think I'm a moron." "Now, that's the first thing you said that makes sense," Benny said. The floor began vibrating under my feet. The shelves were moving. Aunt Verna once told me that a little bit of knowledge never hurt anybody, but Aunt Verna had never been trapped in the stacks with a super. We were about to be crushed by knowledge. I spun on my heels and I pushed Benny back towards the mural and to safety. I couldn't be sure the bookcase was closing in on us, but when we got to the end and I turned around, I saw the stack slowly close against the brick wall. At least Juanita hadn't adjusted the speed. "This is a serious misuse of school property," Benny said, shaking his head. My goal was to lead Juanita into the open area, but now I was mad. "Come on," I spoke so that only Benny could hear. "We're done being pushed around." I walked past several bookcases and I came to an open aisle. I took a few steps in and then bent over, peering between the books on the shelves. I saw a pair of jeans among the stacks. Juanita was 2 aisles in front of me. I walked carefully towards the mural. I stood up and moved to the opposite direction. I walked to circle around and to come up behind her, and Benny followed. "Lie all you want," I said loud enough for Juanita to hear me. "The Baileys are the upholders of truth and justice in Split Rock." "So you Baileys decided to destroy the White Knight diamond in the name of truth and justice?" Then there was another spitting sound. "No, we kept you from stealing it." I got to the end of the aisle and turned right around the corner and entered the aisle where I had seen jeans. Juanita was crouched down, looking between the shelves. I wondered why she wasn't using her X-ray vision. When she spotted me, she stood up straight, knowing she'd been caught. Her face flushed, and for a moment I thought she looked uncertain. Then she scowled, and she folded her arms across her chest, and her dark curly hair falling over both shoulders. Juanita Johnson did not look nice. I could almost imagine fire or lasers or lava shooting out of her eyes. I had to will my feet to stand firm. Benny came and stood next to me, and that helped. "Oh, that's a good one," Juanita said. "Break into a museum, destroy a national treasure, and then try to blame it on us?" "Your family is always involved in evil plans," she continued. "Like the battle last fall when you tried building the giant laser in the thermal underwear factory." "A laser? In the thermal underwear factory? Can you even hear how crazy you sound? Why would anybody do that?" "Because you Baileys are all crazy." Juanita turned her head and spit. There was a garbage can in the general direction she turned, but I doubted she could be that accurate. "That's just like vandalism," Benny said. "You might as well spray paint the mural." I wondered how I could get Juanita back out of into the open, and then I realized I could beat her at her own game. I reached up and pressed the button on the side of the bookcase. The grinding under our feet resumed as the stacks began to slide. I ran towards the open area of the library with Benny on my heels. I cleared the end of the stacks and froze. Mr. Wells sat at his desk, talking to my new teacher, Mr. Johnson. Back into the stacks. This game of cat and mouse was getting intense. There were too many cats. To leave the library, we'd have to walk right past the supervillain. But if we kept running around inside the stacks, we risked bumping into the supervillain. We couldn't go left or right. We couldn't go forward or back. That left only one option: up. Finding an open aisle, I placed my foot on the lowest shelf, testing its strength. I climbed hand over hand until I got to the top of the shelf. Crawling on the top of the bookcase, I turned around and motioned for Benny to come up. He started to climb. Benny was almost to the top when I heard the familiar rumble and looked down. The bookcases were closing in on him. "Benny," I whispered, "give me your hand." "I can't." Benny clung to the bookcase. "If I give you my hand, I'll fall." Oh no, I'd forgotten Benny didn't like heights. But there was no time to argue. Lying flat on my stomach, I grabbed the opposite side of the shelf with one hand, and then I reached down with the other hand and grabbed Benny's belt. I pulled hard, hauling him up on the aisle. The stacks closed together, just missing his right leg. Benny and I lay flat on the shelves. My brother grasped and hung on for dear life. "You just gave me the mother of all wedgies," he said. "And I can't even let go to straighten things up." I got to my feet, crouching low so I couldn't be seen by Mr. Wells or Mr. Johnson at the front of the library. Juanita had to be farther back into the stacks, which meant there was now a gaping space between her and me, and I looked down. The carpet didn't look that soft, and if I was caught jumping on top of the bookcases, somehow I didn't think Mr. Wells would be too happy about that. And I was a superhero. Risk was part of the job description. I spit into my hands and I wiped them on the bottom of my shoes. I didn't want to slip on that dusty bookcases. I stepped to the edge of the shelves, bent over, and jumped. As soon as I was airborne, I heard the bookcases rumble. My instincts took over. The shelf I was jumping to was sliding forward, and now I was heading towards the empty space. I collided with the other side of the shelf, unable to stop, but I pushed myself off almost as soon as I touched it. Instead of falling into the new aisle that was opening up, I went further than I meant to and landed on the top of the group of bookshelves, rolling onto my side. Luckily, there were 5 shelves pressed together, and I had time to bring myself to a stop. Benny was still hanging on to the top of the first bookcase for dear life, but he managed to give me a thumbs up and a grin. I pointed to my eyes with 2 fingers, and then to Benny. I motioned in the direction of Mr. Wells and to Mr. Johnson. I wanted Benny to watch and give me some kind of a signal if either of them moved. Benny nodded and scooted to where he could watch. I only hope that he understood. I was covered in thick dust and felt a scratch in my throat. I resisted the urge to cough as I crawled over to the top of the bookcases. Finally, I came to the next open aisle and looked down. Juanita crouched below, peering between the shelves. She was hunting us all right, but why wasn't she using her super hearing or speed? Maybe I could be a little more bold. I thought back to what she said about the Battle of Thermal Underwear Factory. I remember that battle. Swinging my feet over the bookcase, I took a deep breath, pushed off, and dropped to the floor. I landed 2 feet from Juanita and was rewarded with a look of alarm. Juanita stumbled and fell, landing on her rear end. She scooted back on her hands and feet. I spoke calmly to show I was in complete control. "We got a call from a citizen telling us you were smuggling illegal weapons into the country." Juanita scrambled to her feet, glaring at me. I kept right on talking. "And your family was storing them in that factory. That was one of our greatest battles ever. We beat you even though we were down by 3 people because Uncle Ralph and his family all had dental appointments." I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe for Juanita to attack or for her to keep telling lies. I was ready for anything except what happened next. Juanita softened, and anger in her face diminished and turned into confusion. "We weren't smuggling weapons," she said. "What are you talking about?" "The thermal underwear factory." Juanita looked like she was trying to read my mind. "We got a call from a citizen warning us that you were building a laser. We saved the day by destroying the machinery." I shook my head. "No, I'm pretty sure that machinery was what they used to make thermal underwear." Juanita got to the end of the aisle. "Don't try to confuse me, Rafter Bailey." She turned her head and made a spitting noise. This time, I thought I heard something hit the plastic lining of the garbage can. Juanita pointed at her chest with her thumb. "We are the superheroes. You are the villains." She reached over to the shelf and pressed the button. I was still in the middle of the aisle, no time to reach either end. I jumped back on the shelves and started to climb. The bookcases were closing together. I got to the top just as the shelves slammed shut under me. I signaled to Benny to let him know I was okay. He was waving his arm furiously, pointing towards the wall to my left, and I looked over and saw the top of a head bobbing between the bookshelves. A new voice penetrated the stacks of the library. "Juanita, are you back here?" "Mr. Johnson." I lay down on the top of the bookshelf, trying to make myself as flat as possible. "I'm over here, Uncle Nicholas." Mr. Johnson found Juanita. "Are you okay? I looked for you after lunch." Mr. Johnson didn't sound like a supervillain. He sounded like a concerned uncle. All Juanita had to do was tell her uncle where we were, and there was no escape. Juanita was silent for a few moments. Then she spoke. "I'm fine." "What? Why wasn't she telling on us?" "All right," Mr. Johnson said. "I need to get back to class. I'll see you after school." "Thanks, Uncle Nicholas." I watched Mr. Johnson bobbing his head until he left the stacks. Juanita walked out just behind him, turning back only once to glance over her shoulder. Our eyes met, but I couldn't read her. I got to my feet, perching like a gargoyle on the top of the library bookcase. What was going on? Benny wobbled on his feet, trying to mimic my actions despite his fear of heights. He licked his hands and wiped them on his feet. He jumped over the open aisle and then came and sat next to me. "What was all that about?" he whispered. "What happened?" Before I could admit I had no idea, I saw a bald head turn the corner and re-enter the stacks. Mr. Johnson had doubled back into the library. "Get down," I whispered to Benny. I dropped to my stomach. The library was quiet enough that I could hear his footsteps along the side of the stacks. After a moment, he stopped. "I'm here at this school to protect my niece." Mr. Johnson's voice was flat. "She is important to me. I will not be very nice to anyone who tries to hurt her." Mr. Johnson was moving again. Benny opened his mouth, but I shook my head sharply to silence him. But Benny couldn't control it. He looked like he was about to sneeze. I waved my hands, trying to get him to stop, but there really wasn't any point. Benny curled up on top of the shelves and sneezed. A puff of dust blew into the air. I froze in terror. I was certain that Mr. Johnson would find us now. There was a horrible pause, and then the shelves started to move once again. Benny scrambled, afraid, and his legs slipped over the edge of the shelf just as the bookcase he was on started moving against the back wall. If Benny couldn't pull himself up, he would be crushed. I leaned over to grab Benny's arms, but in doing so I slipped too, and for a brief moment Benny and I held on to each other, a bookcase between us, our feet dangling in midair. I could see the wall getting closer and closer. "Rafter, help!" My grip gave out. I crashed down into the open aisle, landing on my feet, but ramming my shoulder against a shelf. I raced down the aisle and moved to the back wall, terrified at what I would find. What if I saw my brother, his hands on the top shelf of the bookcase? What I saw was my brother, his hands on the top shelf of the bookcase, his feet pressing against the wall behind him. I watched in amazement as he began to push the bookcases back. He looked heroic. He looked super. He was almost horizontal to the ground, keeping who knows how many bookcases from crushing him. But while Benny was pushing the top of the racks back, the bottom of the stacks were still moving forward. I watched in horror as the books began to slide off the shelves. The bookcases started to lean until I was sure it would fall, and a sharp crack pierced the library. It sounded like a tree branch snapping in two. "Uh-oh," I heard Benny say, and then he and the shelf went crashing to the ground. There was another crack as the first shelf tipped into the second one, and then a third and a fourth. Like dominoes, the shelves began tumbling over, books flying everywhere. Dust flew into the air, and the wave of the sound of reverberated around the room. From the office, Mr. Wells shouted, "My library!" Benny staggered to his feet, tripping over books and shaking dust from his shirt. He looked at me and I knew there was only one sensible thing to do. Run. I sprinted towards the far side of the stacks, keeping low behind the toppled mounds of broken bookcases and books, and Benny followed. Students were pouring into the library from the halls. Mr. Wells was yelling at everybody to stay back, but in just a few seconds the library was filled with kids trying to see what had happened. As soon as we were surrounded by students, Benny and I slipped out into the hall. We walked quickly into the nearest exit and then pushed out into the cold afternoon sun. And then we were running, our feet kicking up wet snow, racing along the wall of the school. Did you see that? Benny said. Did you see what I did in the library? I saw. I turned the corner of the school and skidded to a stop next to some bushes. Let's just hope nobody else did. I put my hands on my knees and I breathed hard. We'd made it. We'd come face to face with the super, and we had made it. We were safe. And then I heard feet crunching in the snow, and before I could move, Juanita was upon us. And that's the end of chapter 7. On tomorrow, Tuesday, June 22nd, we will read We Don't Even Have a Taco Night, chapter 8. Have a good evening, and I'll see you tomorrow. Happy reading. Bye-bye.